Hello and welcome to Travel Leaders Podcast. I'm Caroline Bremner, the Head of Travel Research at Euromonitor International. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Imbsen, Director of Sustainability at World Travel and Tourism Council, and Megan Morikawa, Global Sustainability Office Director at Iberostar. Hi Chris and Megan, how are you doing today?
Hi.
Doing well.
Yeah, very good, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for joining me. So Chris, at the end of last year, the World Travel and Tourism Council, the WTTC, published a really fascinating report on the roadmap to net zero emissions. It would be really great if you could give us a short summary of the roadmap and what exactly were the key learnings.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this podcast and also for this opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing at WTTC. So as you know, we are a member-based organization representing the global private sector in travel and tourism, and climate action is the top sustainability priority for our members. And last year, they made it clear to us that they wanted us to develop guidance for both our members and the wider sector to support it on its path towards decarbonization, particularly as there was no comprehensive guidance that looked at the sector as a whole. So our roadmap lays out a pathway to net zero for the sector by 2050. And to do so, it includes a status quo overview of climate actions in the sector with a focus on aviation, cruise, tour operators, OTAs and travel agents, and accommodation. It identifies the key roadblocks and levers for decarbonization. And on the back of this, it offers decarbonization corridors for businesses within the examined industries, including the targets the businesses should be aiming for and guidance on how to reach them. And finally, it ends with a call to action. So there actually are a lot of findings to go through. So please feel free to interrupt in case I drone on for too long. Just starting in terms of key findings on the status quo analysis, our review of previous studies showed that travel and tourism contributes between 8 to 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So clearly, we have an important role to play in the global decarbonization efforts going forward. Unsurprisingly, we found that different industries in travel and tourism vary significantly with respect to their footprint and their emissions profiles, basically because the business models vary so much. And even within the examined industries, big differences exist. So for example, an asset-light tour operator is likely to primarily generate Scope 3 emissions, whereas an asset-heavy one will primarily have Scope 1 emissions. So these differences highlight the importance of differentiated decarbonization approaches. And also, we found that climate targets varied enormously, both across and within the focus industries. Of the 250 businesses we analyzed, 42% had a defined climate target, but these are the large leading organizations of our sector. So we can imagine that the picture among SMEs is less encouraging. And of the 42%, 20% were science-based. There was also a great variety of target metrics. So for example, do they use absolute metrics or intensity metrics such as per kilometer, per passenger, per available lower berth, and so on? They differ with respect to their target dates, the baselines, the commitments themselves. So there is a clear need for more alignment, transparency, and continuity in emissions reporting. We also looked at challenges, as I mentioned, and in terms of challenges, our research highlighted many industry-specific ones, but also some common cross-industry challenges emerged. The first one, obviously, is the measurement and reporting of emissions, especially Scope 3 emissions. So how do you define them? Who's responsible? How do you measure them? It's clear that we need more consistent reporting methodologies and metrics. Also, there's a fragmented and rapidly changing regulatory landscape, which can be confusing and costly for businesses and lead to planning uncertainty. There's often insufficient external and internal budgets for decarbonization, including a lack of government incentives and sometimes a lack of prioritization at the business level for climate action, often because of the lack of clarity from governments on their own priorities. And finally, there's also a need for more sustainable infrastructure to support a green transition, such as retrofitting of ports, airports, energy grids, sustainable buildings, and so on. Tourism businesses can only be as sustainable as their surroundings, in a way. We also looked, as I mentioned, how to accelerate climate action. And here we propose a 3-tiered target framework. This is kind of like the centerpiece of the work, with decarbonization corridors for businesses based on whether they are hard to abate, such as cruise and aviation, easier to abate, such as hotels, or easy to abate, such as OTAs. Basically, our contention is that certain industries can achieve net zero even before 2050 if more ambitious targets are set and different decarbonization approaches are followed. And indeed, this is necessary if we are to start decarbonizing already. And we have a whole bunch of modeling, which we can talk about later if we're interested, which shows how important it is that we stick to these ambitious decarbonization rates. And finally, we end with a call to action to all businesses with appropriate support from governments and industry bodies to, one, set baselines and emissions targets now, if you haven't done so already, and make them as ambitious as possible. Two, to monitor and report your progress. Three, to collaborate within and across industries, including industry alliances, methodological dialogues, supporting your partners and your supply chains, and so on. Four, to provide finance and investment required for the transition, which implies understanding your needs for both adaptation and mitigation and advocating for government support where necessary. And five, raising awareness and building capacities on climate, which involves prioritizing climate change within your organization, investing in human capital, and also doing things such as nudging customers with opt-outs as opposed to opt-ins and so on. So that's in short, what our roadmap looks at.
Great. Yes, it's definitely a very detailed report, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and learned a lot from it. So I would definitely recommend it. And I'd just like to ask Megan, as an active member of the WTTC, how important is the roadmap for lodging players such as Iberostar?
No, absolutely. And as you could see from Chris's description, this is a massively important report, right? Not only is it demonstrating just the size or confirming the size and scale of tourism, which because it represents around 10% of global emissions means a lot of people should be paying attention to whether or not this industry as a whole can decarbonize, right? But I think for us as an accommodation provider, Iberostar is a Spanish-based luxury tourism group. We've got 100 hotels across 16 countries. And for us, it really gives us this sense of urgency to be able to make decarbonization a reality as quickly as possible. I think one of the clearest takeaways that we took from the roadmap is this really does need to be a cross-sectoral collaboration, not only across our supply chain, which I can talk about in a moment, but also across just the tourism industry. The amount of technological challenges that certain subsections of tourism have are vastly, vastly different than what accommodation providers are currently facing. To decarbonize aviation is something that still is years into our future, but hotels can be doing that work now. And so I think this is one of the first takeaways that we brought from the roadmap, which is that these decarbonization corridors means that hotels need to be reaching their targets much faster in order to compensate for the rest of the industry. It's one of the reasons why at Iberostar, we committed in 2020 to reach carbon neutrality by 2030. It's 20 years before when we need to be reaching net zero targets as the planet. And I think that this really helped us to be able to set how ambitious our decarbonization should be amongst that carbon neutrality statement. So we're also working right now to have very, very ambitious decarbonization pathways for our hotels and resorts. But I think what was also really striking to learn from this roadmap was a sense of what different businesses are responsible for, right? Because if you want to talk about a hotel, you would expect that from their operations, the electricity, the fuel that they're using to power their buildings and kitchens and heating, that's supposed to account for only about 30 to 40% of what their expected total carbon footprint is. And the rest of that's in their supply chain. And I think that this roadmap also served as a really important call to say that accommodation providers do need to be thinking very critically about the products that they're using as part of their service, their food, their cutlery, their carbon footprint of their constructions itself. And I think that is also really helping us to have a very ambitious strategy around decarbonizing our supply chain as well.
Great. I mean, that's a very important point that basically it's about, the level of imports of food that's being sort of taken into the country, and then also very much the sort of whole life cycle of buildings and their impacts on the environment. So yeah, it seems like you're taking a very holistic view about the impact in all these your hundreds of hotels. And I just wondered, how does it actually play out in the destinations? What kind of measures are you taking to mitigate the impacts at the destination level?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it also gets to, okay, this is all really great in theory and in modeling, but how do you actually start to make and implement these changes in practice, right? Especially at a destination level. And so we like to think about like two major levers, and there's sub-levers within that. One is the climate mitigation, and then the other is climate adaptation. Those words basically mean that in the mitigation, we need to decarbonize our business as much as possible. And we use primarily 5 levers to do that, right? And they can be relatively simple for accommodation providers. The first is to use less energy per stay, right? There's a lot of inefficiencies that old machinery or that maintenance teams that need to have a new set of training in order to be on top of their game, to be able to help us with our energetic efficiency. That's one of the best ways we can reduce our energetic consumption, which is why at Iberostar we have a goal to reduce our energetic consumption by 35% relative to a 2019 baseline by 2030. That's our first lever. The second lever is electrification. We really can't afford to have any emissions coming directly from our businesses when we have solutions that can remove them all together. So in lieu of using gas boilers, or in lieu of using gas boilers to heat our water, or gas stoves in our kitchens, how can we use electric options? But that really then depends on our ability to engage with the sector, which is why our third lever is renewable energy sourcing from our providers. And oftentimes that means collaborations with government and collaborations with the energy sector in order to make sure that there is energy available in our destinations. But there's really simple mechanisms that a lot of groups can use, like just asking their energy providers if they have certificates for renewable energy available for them to be able to purchase. It's one of the ways that we achieved 100% of our operations in Spain being through renewable energy certificates this year. The fourth lever is the ability to be able to work on decarbonizing your supply chain, right? This is what we were talking before. And the fifth lever is really just making sure that you're taking care of your refrigerant gases, which is a really, really potent greenhouse gas emission. So that's on the climate mitigation side. The climate adaptation, because this is at the scale of a destination, unfortunately, a lot of the places that we operate are going to be heavily, heavily impacted by extreme weather events and beach erosion and sea level rise. And so we're also thinking very critically about how we build resilience in our destinations, working on things like restoring coastal ecosystems to help us reduce wave heights during both throughout the year and extreme weather events, and also working to see whether or not any of the carbon compensation that we need to do in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2030 can be done by protecting and restoring nature in our destinations. So those are some examples of the climate adaptation side.
If I could just jump in, Caroline, listening to Megan, you can imagine how lucky we feel that we have Iberostar among our members, and also a really active member of our sustainability committee and our task force, because they do provide an incredible amount of what best practices and inspiration that we want to share with the rest of our members, and also the wider travel and tourism community. And just to emphasize this point about the importance of pulling your weight and being as ambitious in your decarbonization rate as possible, we did carry out some modeling by combining the proposed average decarbonization rates of our target corridors, which I referenced before. And this allowed us to make projections for absolute emissions between now and 2050. And our models show that between 2023 and 2035, absolute emissions will only decrease moderately, remaining at about 75 to 80% of 2019 emissions. But from 2035 onwards, total emissions and intensity will decrease quickly, mostly driven by sufficient availability of sustainable aviation fuels and new aircraft technology. But importantly, the net zero goal by 2050 can still be achieved even if we increase our projected sector growth rate, although the curve will move slightly upwards before falling off steeply. But if the annual decarbonization rate is lowered by just 1%, total emissions will fall short of the 2050 net zero target, staying at about 30% of the 2019 baseline. So it's absolutely crucial that everyone pulls their weight and are as ambitious as possible. And I think we can clearly see that Iberostar certainly fits into that category.
And it does seem with the recent IPCC report that, there's no time to waste. I mean, that was really stark reading, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was somehow drowned out by other very unfortunate events, but certainly did not make for good nighttime reading.
No, and just the fact that, the world has, already reached and exceeded these thresholds, and we're seeing, as Megan was saying, the sort of the need to protect coral, the need to protect biodiversity and trees, and it just seems, I was very, very shocked by that recent report. And I mean, it does seem also from the roadmap that there's one area that is just so challenging, and it's the Scope 3 emissions. And would you like to explain exactly what that is and why is it so difficult?
I was going to say briefly too, before we jump into Scope 3, I think one of the stark findings from IPCC's report as well is just a reconfirmation of how seriously the travel and tourism sector is going to be impacted by climate change. And one of the questions that I have generally is how seriously are we taking that in boardrooms, right? At Iberostar, exposure to extreme weather events has been our number one risk to the entire business asset for the last 3 years. And I think this is a question that I'm really curious about as well for other tourism businesses, because if it is as serious as something that is risking the product, Caroline, you asked questions about destinations and how those destinations are likely to, possibly degrade relative to impacts of climate change throughout the next couple of decades. And so part of my question is, how seriously are we taking this in boardrooms? Because I think it's good for us to start on this action, but the action needs to be even greater than what we had thought, only 5 years ago.
And interestingly, when we consulted the various industries, we did ask that question. Do you feel that there's adequate support from or interest from leadership in these issues? And we found that there was a correlation between regulatory pressure and interest from leadership. Aviation and cruise, there's a lot of pressure, so the leadership will tend to be very clued in. But with other industries, it's either or. It can go either way.
But there's so many different initiatives that it's, sometimes it's difficult to see the wood for the trees. And, we had COP26, and then, we had the launch of the Glasgow Declaration, which is a really great big sort of, marker and, a flag in the sand, bringing the UN, WTO, Tourism Declares, the Travel Foundation, UNEP, everybody together and encouraging the whole industry to embrace, tourism declares as a rite of passage in their net zero sort of pathway. And I just wonder, how, Chris, you obviously published the roadmap at the same time. How do you ensure that the dots are all joined up together?
Right. So I actually think that the Glasgow Declaration was precisely an example of joined up thinking and of organizations pulling in the same direction. There was a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that we were all together and all aligned for this. So yeah, it was a great example of a sector-wide effort to come together and show ambition and leadership. But of course, there's always more that can be done. And there were so many important organizations that weren't a part of it and that should be going forward. But the Glasgow Declaration doesn't stop in Glasgow. I'd say it starts in Glasgow. So I think it behooves us all to continue roping and support around it and to discuss how to turn this ambition into meaningful action and with clear roles for everyone. Because beyond the Glasgow Declaration, you're absolutely right. There are so many initiatives, and we have all been guilty of duplication in the past and probably will be guilty of duplication in the future. So at WTTC, we're making great efforts to ensure that we're speaking to our peers regularly, including all the ones you mentioned before. And in addition to that, we're lucky to count on our sustainability task force with members like Megan, who is a very active member of our task force, and who are always pointing out to us who we should be speaking to on what issues and what is already going on. So yeah, it's that, there's no magic bullet to this. It's really just picking up the phone, making sure that you're keeping abreast of developments, and then speaking to people.
So, Megan, the will seems to be there. There are a lot of people signing up to the Glasgow Declaration. There's a lot of talk in the industry about tourism being a force for good. How do we actually make that a reality?
Yeah, I mean, you guys are talking about a really an important point here, which is that there's so much that needs to be done, right? How do you kind of filter through all of the calls that are coming out there? And I actually think that it's all interconnected at the end of the day, too, right? And we can talk about climate. And in a silo, we could talk about nature and biodiversity. We could talk about social development, but they really are all so linked to each other that one of the best bits of advice that we could ever give is to just start with something that aligns with your values and aligns with your employees, so that they feel like their businesses are a force for good, right? And that evolution and journey can be something that starts off with just little baby steps. But it does need to pick up the pace relatively quickly, which is why it is so important for leadership to be so involved in this sort of movement, right? I think it's really relevant to note that Iberostar has been an organization that has had strong and deep-rooted values in all of their operations in the 4 generations that the family has owned this business. But our Wave of Change movement started in 2019, effectively, right? And so when we were working to both quantify our carbon footprint and come up with the level of ambition that we set, we very quickly went from 0 to 100 in terms of raising that ambition, and other businesses can do the same. And when you start to see that level of action that can be taken across scale, across multiple political and geopolitical contexts, right? Because we're trying to do this work from Morocco to Cuba to the US to Spain, in all of our properties that are in any of these locations, you start to realize that there actually may also be a tipping point by which not only tourism can do as little damage as possible to these destinations, but can also be a force for regeneration, right? The question becomes, how can tourism actually be a driver for the protection and restoration of nature, be a driver for some of these shifts? This is one of the reasons, too, why we're so enthusiastic and excited to talk with WTTC and to work with you guys, because at the end of the day, what if tourism was the main driver asking for renewable energy in destinations where it is still emerging, right? And how do we make these collective calls together to be a driver for decarbonization that has so many benefits to other parts of society as well? And so I think that despite it being very intimidating and very overwhelming, changes can be made relatively quickly. There's great tools available for businesses to start to say, okay, well, what even is my carbon footprint? And how do I measure that in the first place? And you're really just putting in your energy bills, right? You're putting in your energy bills, it's making calculations for you, and you can start to make changes even before you have a perfect level of measurement around it. This is one of the reasons why we quite like the Glasgow declarations, half your emissions by 2030. Right, so it kind of demonstrates the scale and the speed by which you need to be making these sorts of changes. And if you get a sense of what your emissions are today, then you start to ask the questions of how you get to do that and make it personal for your business, so that those baby steps can hopefully turn into that tipping point where you actually are able to be a force for good in a lot of destinations.
Great. And the thing is, it does feel that, obviously as a research company, we're sort of monitoring and, keeping an eye on the trends, but it does feel like there's a real sense of momentum that's sort of, the industry is accelerating this pathway to net zero. I mean, where exactly do you think the pressure is coming from? Do you think it's internal, or do you think that it is because of what's happening, say, in the EU with the Green New Deal? Or is it consumers? Is it suppliers? Where exactly do you see all the pressure coming from?
Well, I think that the pressure is probably coming a little bit from all of those. But I'd just like to say that I think the pressure is primarily coming from our environment itself. which is affecting us in our normal and professional lives like never before. And you mentioned the IPCC report. It's a dire read. I mean, the issues are right here, right now, and no one can ignore it, whether you're in your personal or professional capacity. And I think that there has to be a concerted public and private push to continue this momentum. The private sector, of course, has a crucial role to play, as it's the largest source of potential investment into a green transition. It has the ability to affect positive change across its value chain. It should seek to engage in policy discussions and cross-disciplinary and global collaboration on technology development, knowledge generation and sharing, and the promotion of green growth. And this is especially important, I'd say, for larger businesses, which in our SME-dominated sector play an even greater role as enablers and supporters of the travel and tourism ecosystem. But governments are equally as important, especially in terms of setting the rules of the game and creating enabling conditions. So I mentioned earlier, businesses need to see clear commitments from governments before they set their own. They need certainty. Why are they going to invest in something if they don't know what comes tomorrow? They also need support in terms of investments and incentives, in terms of research, in terms of infrastructure that enables a green transition, like I mentioned before, in terms of convening industry dialogues, human capital, and so on. So there's a great deal of work to be done.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I also think that sometimes it's helpful to kind of make it realistic, because it can feel very existential and it can feel very pressured. And I think one of the most potent pressures comes from acts that individuals can do, right? Anyone listening to this podcast or is a part of their industry is likely an employee of an organization. And, ideally, you want to be working for an organization that listens to the concerns of your employees. And one of the pressures can also come from employees asking about what is our business doing to help mitigate climate change. And that's a really, really big one. Every individual is also a consumer. And even though the consumer pressure shouldn't be the only driver that drives businesses to be able to take action, it can be a really potent one to signal that these topics are important to the market and have this sort of catalytic effect across everything. So if you're asking, or if you're just simply, asking if that business has a climate strategy, right? Or asking if they've submitted a target to SBTi, which you don't even need to get into the detail. If you ask that question to these businesses, it will start to signal that they need to be taking action. And that's pressure that we're perceiving, but pressure that also can grow by anyone who wants to put that pressure on their businesses or on the things that they're consuming.
There's also, if we think about the current climate, obviously we have the sort of the war in Ukraine, which is really sort of, deserving a lot of attention as this humanitarian crisis unfolds at the heart of Europe. I mean, how do businesses continue to, put the environment and biodiversity at the forefront when they're dealing with such geopolitical challenges, which is, could be potentially very disruptive to their day-to-day? I mean, how do they address that?
I think this is it is a really challenging problem, right? Because I think one of the areas that makes functioning as a business or a citizen in this world, it's just such a complex landscape and complex and wicked problems that we've never really had to deal with as humanity in the past. But I think what is so fundamental is that everyone working on every one of these challenges contributes to a solution, right? And that one of the easiest ways to be able to continue to do work in the face of crises, whether they be political instability, whether they be a global pandemic, is to stick to your values and to stick to what you can provide as a business. For Iberostar, even throughout the pandemic and throughout what is happening right now in Ukraine, for us, the ocean has always been a really strong value of ours. 80% of our properties are coastal. Our family-owned business is from an island in Mallorca, and so we're always looking for these sorts of solutions that can help us to drive answers. But I think if we continue to stick to trying to solve each of these challenges. It can come in many flavors, and everyone provides a piece of the global pie of solutions. And I think that's one of the most important things is to continue knowing that the work that you're doing is still important and is still playing a role. It just might be on a different timeline than what is currently coming in the news and is currently occupying our minds and worries at any given moment.
I do really hope that the spirit of multilateral collaboration on environmental issues continues despite this war. I think that climate may very well drop down the priority list, but we have seen that collaboration has continued on the International Space Station despite whatever else has been going on. I hope that we can find a way to look past issues and work together on the environment. And indeed, as many governments now, they'll start to ramp up their defense budgets again. I am concerned about what this means for the environment. I do hope that the need for energy independence pushes European states, especially to speed up renewables. This, I think, is the big hope. I also hope that we don't push for short-term heavy fossil fuel solutions that could become long-term if environment simply just doesn't, make its way back up the agenda. So I think that there's lots of reasons for consternation. War is, for unfortunate platitude here, but war is bad, but on every front. But let us just hope that we can keep our eye on the ball in terms of the environment and renewables in particular.
Sure. And what exactly comes next after the roadmap? So it's very comprehensive, but how do you see the roadmap sort of developing and evolving in the next few months and years?
Well, we're currently working on a piece on biodiversity. There was COP26 on climate last year. This year there'll be COP15 on biodiversity, which is many are calling the equivalent of the Paris COP, but for biodiversity, where they'll be adopting the post-2020 biological biodiversity framework. And biodiversity is one of the three planetary crises up there with climate, and so it should be tackled hand in hand with climate, as these issues are so intimately intertwined. It would be a shame to address them in silos. And we also, of course, hope to start some work on Scope 3 methodologies. But the one thing that we're finishing off now, which I'm truly excited about, is our work to expand our economic impact reporting to include environmental and social data. So soon we will be able to tell you per dollar GDP generated by travel and tourism at a global and at national levels, how many emissions were produced, how much water was consumed, blue, green, grey water, for example, what was the energy composition that went into that, divided by renewables, coal, hydro, and so on, what resource inputs went in, and we'll be able to track this over time and across regions and countries. And this will provide us, a very much needed benchmark, and will also provide great comparative analysis data for when we look into policies and so on to see what is working, and hopefully, again, be able to provide, good examples and best practice that can inspire destinations and businesses around the world.
Gosh, that sounds like you are, going to shine such a light on the metrics, which is so important. And what's the kind of timescale for that? Because that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, well, I'm sitting on some data already. I'd love to share some of it, but we do have to keep it to ourselves for the moment. I think that we may launch it in time for the events towards the end of the year, which include the New York Climate Week, COP27, and of course our own summit in Saudi Arabia.
Great, looking forward to that.
No, absolutely. And to complement what Chris is saying, right, I think it's so important that we have organizations like WTTC who are helping to show and shine light on where it is that we need to be going and thinking next. And I think another important message is, what's next after the roadmap for businesses? It's the doing, right? We need to be implementing and incrementally changing fundamentally how we do our businesses in order to meet the scale of these crises. And And I think it's so important too that this is done in baby steps. 35% energy savings by 2030. For us, that means 8% this year, right? And it means portions of steps along the way to how much electrification we can do, or how much decarbonization we can do in our supply chain. And I encourage you to hold us accountable to that through our reports that we have on these targets and roadmaps that we have set out to make sure that we can take these incremental steps to get there. But I think that is one of the most important messages for any businesses out there is that now the next step after these great documents is to just start, right? To just start and to make progress as incrementally as possible so that you build the muscle to be able to scale that as quickly as possible.
And just thinking about tourism in general, obviously we've had 2 years of the pandemic where at some points we had zero tourism. And, last year didn't turn out to be the year that we'd hoped for recovery because we had Omicron, we had Delta, that delayed, the sort of us moving out of the pandemic into the endemic stage. So, do you feel that, are you feeling optimistic about 2022? Do you feel like this is going to be travel and tourism's year? And, how do you see it panning out?
Well, I think that people have embraced travel and tourism basically as a human right. And, everyone's itching to go. And definitely the mood around here is that things are almost back to normal. And even though there are new varieties coming out, they seem to be getting less and less severe. So I think that there's definitely optimism in the air. I think that our projections as WTTC are that tourism will bounce back fairly strongly. And personally, after we're having our summit, a WTTC summit in Manila on the 20th to 22nd of April. And I'll be taking some holiday myself at the end of that for at least a week to explore the beautiful islands around there. So I'm looking forward to being a tourist myself this year.
I think we all are so enthusiastic to be able to get out and do that sort of traveling. And I think if there's any message that we also learn when being cooped up for many years, it's the importance of being able to get out and discover these places, right? That's also really important for these destinations, and a large part of their income and their GDP. Many countries depend on tourism in order to do that. And I think it's so important too that we also take our calls as consumers to have more sustainable tourism as a result of that very seriously, right? As we're starting to take some of these steps, this is how all of us can contribute to make sure, we have the capacity to make 2022 travel's best recovery year yet by helping to decide that when we travel, we would like for it to be as sustainable as possible, and asking some questions to our business providers around that is a really great way to be able to make sure that we take that step down that pathway.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris and Megan. There have been some really empowering messages from you both today, and it's just been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Travel Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much for listening. Join us next time for Travel Leaders podcast.